So hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Leela McClintock, and I am a project lead here at CRDF Global. I want to thank you all for joining today's webinar on mitigating key risks to critical infrastructure in Ukraine. Over the course of today's webinar, you will hear from critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, and physical security experts on the ways in which cross-sector collaboration can enhance international response to pressing security threats. The central theme of the webinar highlights the importance of acting urgently to these existing threats against critical infrastructure, and will emphasize that assistance must be timely and targeted to mitigate long-term consequences within the broader international system. I will now pass along the next portion to my colleague Vladlen, who will provide an overview in Ukrainian, as well as share some technical details. Vladlen, over to you.
Thank you, Leela. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear participants from Ukraine, US, UK, and EU countries and some other countries of the world. And I would like to greet everyone joining our webinar on the emergent actions to overcome the cyber and physical threats to critical infrastructure of Ukraine. My name is Vladlen Basiste. I'm the Senior Manager on Cybersecurity at the CRDF Global. And I'd like to say that I'm very happy to see so many participants of the webinar that are truly excited in learning more information. They're ready to share some of their time and efforts to ensure the protection of critical infrastructure. And also, I'd like to point your attention to the fact that there will be a chat available through the Zoom. So please ask your questions. You can write either in Ukrainian or English. And during the Q&A session, we'll have a chance to send those questions to the speakers. But whenever you'll be addressing with the question, please mention which organization or agency you represent and to whom this question is addressing to. So let us go straight to the main portion of the webinar. And I'd like to pass the floor to Tina Dolf, the Chief Operational Director at CRDF Global. And Tina will be moderating our today's activity. So Tina, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Vladlen, and thank you, Leela, for those nice introductions. Good day, everyone. And I'd like to also second our welcome to all of you who are joining us for this very important topic today. As Vladlen said, my name's Tina Dolf. I am the Chief Operating Officer here at CRDF Global, and I'm very excited to be the moderator for our important conversation today. CRDF Global is an independent nonprofit organization. We were established back in 1995, and our mission is to promote safety, security, and sustainability through international development and foreign assistance missions in over 120 countries. We have been resident in Ukraine since 1997 and have been honored to be partnered with them in their cybersecurity resiliency effort since 2019. As Leela mentioned, during today's conversation, we will analyze the disruptive threats to the critical infrastructure sector in Ukraine and propose solutions to the consequences of cyber and physical security risks. Today's webinar features experts from the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Catalysto, and CRDF Global, all who will share key analysis and lessons learned amid wartime conditions in Ukraine. To get today's conversation started, please join me in welcoming Mr. Serhiy Propyenko. Serhiy is the head of the National Cybersecurity Coordination Center of Ukraine at National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. In his position, Serhiy is responsible for the coordination of all the stakeholders, developing the NCSCC's analytical technological platform, improvement of CTI exchange and sharing mechanisms, organization of training programs for specialists from the public sector and critical infrastructure, and building public-private partnerships international cooperation, and the control of the cybersecurity strategy implementation plan. Serhii has over 20 years experience in cybersecurity, incident response, digital forensics, cyber threat intelligence, cybercrime investigations, and the development of enterprise cybersecurity systems. As you can see, he is more than qualified to join our panel today. So to everyone, please join me in welcoming Serhii to the conversation. Serhii, over to you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for such a great introduction of me.
My pleasure, sir.
Прошу включити тоді презентацію.
So
так?
please, could you start sharing my presentation? Just a second, we'll do that. Because, okay, there it is. So please, Serhii, the presentation is already on the screen. Thank you once again. As I've already mentioned, I'm Serhii Prokopenko. I'm working at one of the agencies at the NSDCU of Ukraine, that's National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine. And I thank two organizers for the chance to discuss this very important topics, because indeed the critical infrastructure in Ukraine is facing very significant threats, both in the cyber and in the physical dimensions. And I believe that sharing the experience in countering the threats and sharing some of the needs in order to recover some of our infrastructure, sharing those needs with international partners, this is very important. And I would like to once again thank to CRDF Global for the possibility to participate in this event. Next slide, please. So, talking about the war currently, and unfortunately, some still believe that the war has started this year, even though everyone in Ukraine knows that the war has initially started in 2014. Therefore, it was during that time that the Crimea was occupied. Later on, they've occupied some parts of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. From the standpoint of cyber dimension, it has also found its reflections in starting from 2014. Russian Federation has conducted a series of large-scale attacks against the Ukrainian infrastructure. Back in 2014, during the elections of the president, there was a number of DDoS attacks. They've compromised the website for the Central Election Committee in order to attempt to have an impact on the results of the elections. Then in 2015 and 2016, Ukraine has become the first country to face an attack against the energy sector. Now, these attacks resulted in several blackouts in two regions of Ukraine. That is, in 2015, there was a black energy attack targeted against the informational systems of Prekarpatia Oblenergo, resulting in over 230,000 people facing electricity cuts. Then, in the beginning of the next year, as the result of the attack, several Kyiv districts faced blackout as the result of the attack against Kyiv Oblenergo. Then, during that attack, the Russians were using a destroyer. And I would like to focus your attention on that because this destroyer was not the only step that they've made, the Russians made. They continued doing so, and they're continuing to use this type of malware in order to launch their attacks against Ukraine, and similar attacks might be launched against other countries. Then, back in 2017, there was, I think, the largest attack was mounted against Ukraine. It was a NotPetya attack. I think it covered a lot of agencies around the world, and many agencies and organizations lost their data. And it was kind of a ransomware malware, and resulting in this damage and destruction of data and information systems of entities around the world. We have to focus that one of the priority targets for Ukraine, they've selected the National Bank of Ukraine and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And the attack against this nuclear power plant produced several of the elements being inaccessible, which produced significant risk. Then over several decades, over the past several decades, all of the Russia's attacks in cyber dimension, it goes along with the informational operations against the citizens of Ukraine, against the citizens of the European Council, US, UK, other countries. And the only purpose is to create a fake image of the occupation of Crimea. Also, they're using narratives referring to the fact that there is this civil war in Ukraine and not the invasion of Russia. Then one of the constant narratives is the weakness of Ukraine in different spheres, starting from the state governance and all the way to the protection of its own resources. Personally, I was involved and I talked to some of the foreign journalists on the situations and the cyber dimension of Ukraine. And I can still hear questions like why Ukraine is so weak in the cyber dimension, even though most of the people clearly realize that this is not the truth. But still, those myths that were distributed by Russia can have an impact on the apprehension of the situation in Ukraine. And they create a kind of an agenda that is necessary for Russia. Let's go to next slide. But if we talk about the actions taken this year, then we can see that the preparation, I would say active preparation to the invasion into Ukraine, it started in September, October of last year. It was since that moment that we've detected an increase by 20 to 30% in the different sort of malware activity against all the infrastructure facilities of Ukraine. I'm talking about the public entities as well as the critical infrastructure of different forms of ownership. So it could be private companies, public companies, all of them were facing under constant pressure on their information systems. Then, in the beginning of January this year, more specifically on the 13th of January, we've faced the so-called Operation Bleeding Bear. Now, during that operation, they've coordinated the cyber operation in order to compromise 22 public organizations of Ukraine, and they've displayed some fake information on the website of this public websites. It was kind of a defense operation, and then there were attempts to use the so-called software for destroying the information and data. And that is where Russia has clearly demonstrated they're trying to well, prove that they're far more developed in terms of the cyber dimension, and they're trying to destroy our critical infrastructure. What's interesting is that this attack, it was coordinated and responded through cyber training, because it involved different groups of cyber experts, not only those groups of experts dealing with cyber espionage and cyber intelligence, but also the commercial cyber experts. So Russia has tried to use all of its potential on this date, but at the same time, the negative was rather the impact was rather negative, because this event, it showed that our services responsible for cyber protection and cybersecurity, they can organize a coordinated response to even such a complicated incidents. And then in the course of a couple of days, the whole infrastructure was restored. We've made some lessons learned, so to say, out of this. And later on, this has become like an element that provided even more sort of level of protection or resilience to our systems. Then it happened so like a week or 10 days before the large-scale attack. So starting from the 15th of February until the 24th of February. So that's basically the start of a large cyber war, active cyber war against Ukraine. And I would say that almost every informational system of Ukraine faced with different levels of intrusion into their activity. And I think that was the most difficult period, when all the services were engaged, all the partners were engaged. We've engaged private sector and volunteers, and all of them tried to actively deter and respond to cyber attacks that kept mounting every single hour. Later on, I think it was in March, April this year, this intensity has reduced slightly. And should we take the banking sector or the energy sector, we can see that there weren't too many of the critical incidents. Then speaking of the banking sector, indeed, there were some massive DDoS attacks. And within a short intervals of time, we had like some of the resources, the National Bank and some of the other major banks went offline, but that was for a short period of time. And they were trying to use the Vipers and the internal networks of the banks. And there were several incidents in major banks when, unfortunately, their internal networks were compromised. But this happened primarily through the compromising of some logins and accounts offering access inside the network. And then the attackers were trying to use those accesses in order to destroy the information. And on the overall, we've registered 8 high-level incidents against the banking sector during that time. Now, talking about the energy sector, we have a similar situation, but as I've already told you, one of the major incidents took place in April in one of the energy facilities. We've identified the use by Russia. I beg your pardon, I apologize, just a second. So they were using malware called Indestroyer 2, and that was specifically designed to damage the energy facilities. Now, what was the difference in between of this attack and the previous one? This malware was specifically designed for being used against our networks. So they knew what industrial controllers, which SCADA systems are being used in our facilities. So what they've tried to use, that was specifically designed to destroy the energy facilities of Ukraine in order to produce a blackout for all the users of this or that energy facilities. And the other challenge we faced was that I'm sorry, I've lost the speaker for a second. And also unfortunately, they have access to the informationals systems at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And since they have physical access, they might try to plant another attacks. And over a certain period of time, we were registering their attempts to use the captured segments of the network in order to, well, to penetrate our own systems. But thanks to the joint efforts of all the entities, we've managed to deter this, to prevent this from happening, and we keep on doing the monitoring. We're monitoring all of those attempts. And on this graph, you can see the number of incidents and you can see their increase. So that's an absolutely valid graph, and it shows the number of network incidents in one of our largest energy providers. And we can see that there was a 6-fold increase in the first month after the beginning of the full-scale aggression. Now, please go to next slide. Now, the situation has changed slightly, and we can see the continuation of this graph. And you can see that starting, I think, from September, there's a reduction in the overall number of security incidents. Although in most of the segments, particularly we're talking about the energy sector, there's in fact an increase in the number of incidents related to the password, selecting and in using those passwords for other systems, so-called credential stuffing attacks. And we can see that there is this targeted phishing also available. Then in case of banking sphere, in addition to phishing, there's also an increase in the number of frauds trying to exploit the topic of assisting Ukrainian citizens, like as if there is an assistance to Ukrainian citizens from international organizations. So these are the attacks that are targeted against the people who are just ordinary citizens of Ukraine. That is why we're elaborating the mechanisms right now to prevent this from happening. And this is going to be based on, or rather an element of fulfilling the cybersecurity strategy. So we'll be building some scenarios. We've already negotiated with providers. We have a group of experts, which are the major entities of cybersecurity protection field. And now we can surely say that these attacks will be blocked very soon. But the banking sphere and the energy sector are not the one that are facing the largest number of incidents. Currently, this is the telecommunication and IT sector, and we can see that the objective of that is to mount more and more attacks, because the Ukrainian suppliers of the IT services, they provide services not only to Ukraine, but they're also working in the Western market. So the Russians are trying to, have more influence, to have more impact and try to penetrate other networks. And we can see that in serious cases, in several cases, they are successful when there's an attacks against Metro mounted from Ukraine, resulting in the compromising of certain networks and some other entities. Now, there's one more trend, that is the Russia started to sort of select very carefully the targets for their attacks. So they're not attacking everything, but they're carefully analyzing the information that they've received during the previous attacks. And then they modify their attacks in a manner to produce the largest damage possible. I would also like to point your attention to the fact that over the last month or so, we've seen an increase in the intensity of cyber agents or cyber actors from in other countries, particularly in Iran. And we're also kind of developing. And over the past a year and over this year, we've done a lot. We've initiated the establishment of cyber forces, also special centers on cyber security at energy sectors, and there was a decision of the NSDC, and it also allowed to focus on the cybersecurity issues in the electricity sector, as well as the oil transportation and gas production sectors as well. And over the past year, we've conducted over 20 training and seminars, and over 1,300 participants participated in this training. I'd like to thank CRDF Global for supporting us in implementing or in conducting of those seminars. We've did TTX, strategic TTX exercises, and we had some grid networks also organized for a lot of participants. And starting from this year, as I've told you already, in response to cyber attacks, as part of the Bleeding Bear operation, we've gathered the emergent meeting of NCCC, and we've elaborated the list of activities that we would need to come up with in order to enhance the cybersecurity of public agencies. And also, we've created a response group, and it worked 24/7 until the 26th of February. And as I've told you, we've learned how to work with other companies.
There are some problems with communication, I guess. That describes what each of the major entities needs to be doing during such important, difficult cyber incidents that require joint response. There were 15 meetings of the National Cybersecurity Cluster, and very soon we plan a national defense cyber hackathon and strategic exercises of a high level on cybersecurity. However, most of our achievements would not be possible without support of our volunteers, without support of volunteers from the whole world who helped to achieve the to help us to defeat Russia in cyber field too. We announced a call to build the cyber reserves, and the idea was to engage the private sector to protect the resources of Ukraine from cyber attacks. And there was a very effective response. So before the invasion, we had about 600 applicants, and whom we later used to counter cyber threats of Russia. It happened through coordination of various groups, and there were different goals in cyber area, in informational area, and the objective was to communicate truth to Russians and share information about the crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine, to collect information about the movement of Russian troops in Ukraine and so on. And certainly it would be impossible to imagine our victory without our cooperation with international partners. I think the major ones were here, the joint responses to the attacks of Russia that we had on behalf of the US and the EU. As response to cyber attacks that happened before the invasion and during the invasion. Ukraine joined the Tallinn NATO Excellence Center on Cybersecurity, and in practical sense, we are supported by cyber threat intelligence exchange that helps us to analyze what's going on in this cyberspace more effectively. We were also supported with the sanctions and the fact that many vendors left the Russian market. And to wrap it up, coordination is very much important. Decentralization, effective coordination help to be effective in difficult conditions. The support of partners and volunteers, effective exchange of information are necessary, and they also certainly building trust between all the actors is highly important. Something that we've been working on right now, we are building the national DNS. We are working to implement a cyber range project that would enable everyone to get practical training there. We want to create a project office that would facilitate and strengthen our capacities. We are working to enhance the cybersecurity on the regional level, local levels, and we have interest here to get hardware and software and practical expertise. We understand that we need to study in depth what has happened over these months, and we initiated the establishment of some sort of an institution that would be studying the cyber war. And we certainly need to recover our infrastructure to restore it, both physically and in cyber field. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions of yours.
Thank you so much, Sergey. Very informative and helpful comments. We are capturing some questions in the chat, and once we finish with the panelists, we'll open it up for a conversation among the four panelists. So for all the participants out there, excuse me, if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will do our best to answer all questions throughout the webinar. Well, as Sergey mentioned, obviously the cybersecurity and the infrastructure attacks have been pretty significant not only in the recent months, but as he discussed, starting well back into 2014, 15, 16. Next, I'd like to bring to the stage a woman who is very integral in thinking about the critical infrastructure protection as we move forward. So please join me in welcoming Mrs. Irina Tomyshenko. She is the head of the Service of Critical Infrastructure Protection at National Security and Defense Council in Ukraine. Irina is in that position. She has held it since 2020. During this time, she was a co-author of the Law of Ukraine on Critical Infrastructure, which was approved back in December of 2021. Ms. Irina Tomyshenko holds a master's degree in economics and has more than 25 years of work experience in these public services. I had the pleasure of meeting Irina last August while I was in Krakow, Poland, and I can assure you we are in for a very engaging conversation with her today. So thank you, Irina, for being here today. We are looking forward to your comments, and I will turn it over to you.
Доброго дня, доброго вечора.
Good afternoon, good evening. I'm happy to welcome all the participants of the event. Thank you, Tina, for introducing. I'm happy to see you again. It was very interesting to talk to you in August in Poland. I remember our meeting. Thank you for your time. I want to thank our partners, constant partners, for this opportunity to talk with you about this critical issue that we have in the area of critical infrastructure of Ukraine. Indeed, the issue of critical infrastructure has been introduced into legislation only recently. Last year, the law on critical infrastructure was adopted, and it was enacted only on 15th of June, 2022. And this law determines the legal and national principles for the creation and functioning of the National Critical Infrastructure Protection System. And this law is a component of the legislation in the field of national security. This law determines the components that belong to the National Critical Infrastructure Protection System. You can see on this slide. Number one is the Cabinet of Ministers that ensures the implementation of the state policy in the field of critical infrastructure protection of Ukraine. There is also another important body, it's authorized body in the field of critical infrastructure protection that ensures the formation and implementation of the state policy in the field of critical infrastructure protection, performs the functional management of the National Critical Infrastructure Protection System, and ensures coordination of the activities of the ministries and departments and critical infrastructure operators in matters of ensuring the resilience and protection of critical infrastructure objects. Also, this system includes sectoral and functional bodies that carry out the formation and implementation of the state policy in certain sectors of critical infrastructure. Please bring back the slide. The next component in this system is certainly local executive authorities. On their level, they develop and approve local programs to ensure the safety and resilience of critical infrastructure. And finally, obviously, critical infrastructure operators who ensure the protection and are responsible for the protection of the objects. The law of Ukraine on the critical infrastructure was developed during the peacetime, but some elements need to be taken account during the war time, martial law. And in Ukraine, we have the law, the legal regime of martial law. So once the president of Ukraine introduced the martial law, or in all regions for the duration of this martial law, established military administrations. And these military administrations carry out the measures of the legal regime of martial law, defend civil protection, public safety and order, critical infrastructure protection, protection of rights, freedoms, and legitimate interest of citizens. NDRS coordinates and oversees over the activities of regional military administrations. Okay, that's done by the general staff. But as to the other matters that are not related to security and protection, that is the domain of the Cabinet of Ministers. Among recent events, we decided on this important body on the protection of critical infrastructure. Some amendments have been introduced into the law, which was adopted on the 18th of October, and it will take effect on 5th of December. So during the martial law and during 12 months after it is lifted, the authorized body in the field of protection of critical infrastructure these authorities will be performed by the state special service of special communications and information protection of Ukraine. Now we are preparing appropriate mechanisms and structures for that. As to the NSDC, in the conditions of martial law, the NSDC coordinates and implements supervision over the activities of executive authorities in the field of national security and defense. What our services have been doing so far, you probably know that since October the 10th, there have been a few really massive attacks on critical infrastructure in Ukraine, and we undertook this role of coordinator to combine efforts and protect the critical infrastructure. The roles of general staff and other bodies that were responsible for the security and defense sector. I mean, the National Guard, the state emergency service, and the territorial defense units, and others. So we coordinate this work with operators of critical infrastructure. And as we coordinate, we established cooperation with all the actors involved. We prepared guidances on how to use the air defense systems and engineering protection systems. So now we continue working, and we have some achievements already, because everyone is working as part of a single mechanism. On the 24th of February 2022, when the large-scale invasion was started, our energy system was disconnected from the Russian power grid. And a lot of actions were done before it happened, and it happened overnight, really. And our system demonstrated its resilience because before the until the 15th of April, our system was operating without any other systems, and only on the 15th of April we managed to get connected to the EU energy system. The attacks on our power plants started from the beginning of the war, and you can see on this slide how much money is needed to repair the damage, and all the public utility companies are also suffering from the invaders. On all the deoccupied territories, we face a situation when all public utility enterprises have been damaged or destroyed, and unfortunately, those areas now remain without those very important enterprises. I want to talk a little bit about what has been going on since the 10th of October. Maybe you know that on the 10th of October, there was a first massive attack on our energy facilities, and a lot of missiles were used to hit our power units, power plants, and unfortunately 84 of attacks hit those. Although our air defense system managed to destroy 90% of the attacks, but you can imagine how massive the attack was since 84 missiles hit their targets, and substations of 750 kilowatts were hit, and each of those substations provides electricity not to many regions. Unfortunately, they all were damaged. Our power workers focused their efforts immediately on repairs and providing electricity to our people. Smaller substations of 330 kilowatts, there were 13 of them that were damaged. So you can imagine that the energy system right now is in a very difficult condition now, but our experts are working to ensure supply of electricity to consumers. A couple of points about our nuclear power plants. You probably know that since March 2022, the Russian Federation occupied our most powerful and the biggest nuclear power plant. It's the biggest in Europe, and it's in Zaporizhia. They're still there, and very dreadful events are going on there. The staff of the station are being abducted, tortured. They are forced to go under control of the Russian Federation. All 6 power units are dysfunctional. The units number 5 and 6 are in cold condition, and others are in idle condition, but they are being powered from the power system of Ukraine. So there was no switch to the Russian power grid. They didn't manage to do it. Other our stations are working in regular mode. We conduct planned repairs there, but they can also sustain attacks from Russia. the danger is still there.
Тут ви можете побачити
You can see here our top companies, operators of critical energy system that have sustained losses. You can see that those losses amount to many billions of dollars that need to be invested now to renovate and recover this infrastructure. I didn't speak about the urgent needs because the Ministry for Energy is collecting this information jointly with the operators of critical infrastructure. So if our international partners can provide us with support, I think I can send those lists to them because it's impossible to put them on one slide. I can only state that there are needs for transformers, for other types for backup power supply. We need support in terms of spare parts for those transformers. So if you're interested, we can share these lists. I have already said that we hold a lot of meetings to ensure joint efforts of all the component security and defense sector and operators of the critical infrastructure. And there are some problematic issues there too. Now we are creating teams that gonna serve at every critical infrastructure object. So we will kind of intensify the efforts here, efforts of the armed forces, the National Guard, and the State Emergency Service. But because of this permanent threat of strikes and use of missiles and kamikaze drones, we don't have enough, sufficient number of communication means. Those teams that we are creating, they realize that there is a shortage of the communication devices, and that doesn't allow us to ensure centralized management of air defense systems, and that may lead to the fact that we can miss some of the missiles. It's important not to miss any of those missiles, and we should take every action we can to avoid those strikes. And this is actually the need. We have determined 200 most important critical infrastructure objects, and this slide shows those technical means that we need. We need about 3 or 4 sets for each object, and the additional means we need about 4 to 6 sets for each critical infrastructure object. So if you can support, we would really appreciate it. Next slide. Another problematic issue is the system of training of CIP specialists. According to the law of Ukraine on critical infrastructure, each sectoral bodies or ministries or departments responsible for their sector of critical infrastructure must create units. And we now see the problem with shortage of specialists. And even we don't have sufficient numbers of teachers. instructors. We know that the competent specialists are the keystone for the development of any state, in particular the protection of critical infrastructure. Last year, we conducted many seminars, trainings, exercises for the specialists of ministries and departments, and for people who work in the critical infrastructure objects, as well as we involved local government officials to those events, because on the local level there are a lot of gaps. What we need, this is the next slide, what we need in terms of development of the system of training. We need the development of requirements for educational programs that would form the competencies of graduates who would be able to work in the field of CIP and create new specialties. In CIP, we are considering this issue now. We also need to develop educational and training programs which require training of graduates who are able to work in the field of CIP, and we also need to develop the institutions whose missions are to ensure the security sector with skilled personnel. So the protection of critical infrastructure in Ukraine, the system is only being developed, so we have needs in every field of CIP. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Irina. As we can see, there are many needs, and hopefully, as we move forward to the conversation, we can talk about that some more and find some help and satisfying some of those needs. Thank you, both you and Serhey. You talked about the importance of partnership, with industry and partnership with other countries and so forth. So now it's a good time to bring in one of our industry partners to the conversation. So with that, let me just move this up here. I would like to introduce to everyone Ms. Claudia Iannazzo. Claudia is the Chief Executive Officer at Catalysto. Catalysto is a provider of cybersecurity sourcing, testing, and capacity development services to critical infrastructure stakeholders globally. Her firm provides sourcing, testing, and capacity development services to operators, companies, service providers, and governments worldwide, and has centers of excellence in New York, Orlando, Lugano, and Johannesburg. Claudia herself has worked in emerging technology commercialization and innovation for over 20 years. She has facilitated more than $10 billion of alliances, partnerships, acquisitions, and investments around the globe. She started her first company in compliance management while at university, and her career has spanned 5 continents, working on a broad range of safety and security initiatives, from patrol boats to Vietnam, to remote location logistics, to NATO and other defense programs as head of the commercial for the weapon systems division of BAE Systems. Claudia, we're very interested in hearing about your perspective on the issues that have been brought forward so far in the webinar. So we're looking forward to your comments, and I'd like everyone to join me in welcoming you to the conversation. Claudia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Tina, and thank you also to CRDF and NSPC for allowing me to speak today. So I'm going to focus a little bit broader than just Ukraine in these slides, and I've been asked to speak to you a little bit about what's going on more broadly in Eastern Europe. Some quick kind of summaries as to some things we're going to cover today. The key insight for us as a cybersecurity provider is not everything has changed. And I know it feels very tumultuous. There's a lot of changes going on, but some things are very consistent, which is fairly interesting. Russia's war with Ukraine is clearly diverting the attack landscape. And this particular cyber war is unique in the role of activists and third parties, clear coordination of cyber attacks with kinetic action, and an increasing sophistication of the adversary to sidestep traditional defenses and traditional security appliances. And so the pressure's on to act quickly throughout Europe for European stakeholders, both as donors and beneficiaries. And it's not just forcing changes in the governments, it's also forcing changes in how providers such as ourselves design, deliver, and respond to those requests. So let's dive straight in. A couple of quick things about us. Catalysto and our sister company, Loki Labs, have worked across a broad section of the US government, including civilian assistance, defense, and other agencies. We've worked across the world, as you can see, and we specialize in building the cyber defense capabilities of critical infrastructure stakeholders. We have extensive experience in technical assistances throughout Eastern Europe, and we've been actively supporting US government initiatives in this region for many years. We've been in Ukraine for the last 3 years, but this year, for example, we have also, on behalf of the US government, assisted more than 12 other Eastern European countries to better put their shields up, to discover and mitigate their vulnerabilities, and to respond to disabling attacks. We're going to talk, I want to take you through just a quick overview of Europe. Mr. Prokopenko gave an amazing overview, an in-depth overview of Ukraine. But it's worth you seeing how the landscape has shifted in the last, let's call it 18 months, 20 months. So this is how the attack landscape looked last year, calendar year 2021. And broadly speaking, and what you see here is the number of cyber attacks on European countries. And broadly, the attacks follow GDP. Germany and France are definitely experiencing the highest number of attacks, followed by UK and Switzerland. And as you can see, last year, Ukraine was not in the top 10. In total, there are about 2,200 major cyber attacks in European countries. This data set, by the way, is from an analyst called Conbriefing. And I like them particularly because they focus on European cyber attacks, and particularly those on government entities. Each of the different data sets is a little different. So let's look at what's happened calendar year to date, right? This year, 2022. So Germany and France, they've still got the top position. But suddenly Russia's on the scene in third position in terms of most targeted countries. And you can see Ukraine has arrived at position number 6. You've got a couple of folks who've stepped up. Italy has more than doubled the number of attacks on Italy. Spain has more than doubled, and Belgium is almost doubled. So the attacks in Europe are actually increasing in some areas. You can also see we're not even, this data set does not really incorporate October, November, December, and we're already 10% up on this time for the full year last year. So, we're looking at this stage at having 40% more cyber attacks in Europe than were experienced in the calendar year last year. Of course, there's Russia and Ukraine. So let me take you into a little bit more detail, and let's plot it over time. So this is the volume of the cyber attacks on various European countries over the course of the last 18 months. And I will say all data sets, except data sets like those that Mr. Prokopenko showed you, are flawed, because not every government will report all of their attacks publicly. Often they're looking to hide their attacks. And this is not just governments, this is also stakeholders because they don't want to reveal that they're weak. And some countries have very, very different regimes as to whether they force reporting of the attacks or they don't. As a result, the data set is flawed unless you get it directly from a government stakeholder. And so this is a open source data set. So, you know, I just want to put out there, it definitely has a bias, and the bias is to publicly disclosed attacks. And it does not pick up many of the attacks that Mr. Prokopенko was talking about that are not generally publicly disclosed. So first off, let's take a look at this chart. You can see there is a really interesting event that occurs in February, right? And the number of attacks then recovers, and ordinarily we would be expecting the number of attacks to continue upwards and to the right with this yellow dotted line. The reason we're not seeing it just yet is there is definitely a time lag in reporting of data. Now, Mr. Prokopенko did note a dip in July. We have also seen that right across the board and looking at European data. It may also be, you know, there may be some reporting delay in there. So we won't really know for another couple of months based on the publicly available information what's really happened. But it does look like there is some form of adjustment in July. Of course, you see in February that hard dip, you see corresponds with Russia illegally invading Ukraine. What is really interesting about this is that these major cyber attacks are perpetrated not just by nation states, but they're financially motivated attackers. There are other forms of attackers. This year particularly, we have seen the rise of hacktivism, and yet they all stopped in January and March. And what this suggests very strongly is that certain governments are directing the activities of many of these threat groups, and in fact, probably nationalize them in anticipation of an offensive against Ukraine. And then what you can see with the time lag is those hacktivist groups are getting back to work and driving their financial gains. So let's step back, and instead of thinking about everyone from Switzerland to Moldova, let's just look at Europe and Eurasia. And I'm going to use the USA definition here. And this is not the entirety of Europe and Eurasia. It's for these purposes, we'll talk about the countries of Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cyprus, Georgia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Moldova, Russia, Serbia, and Ukraine. So this is traditionally the USAID definition of Europe and Eurasia, with a couple of things that have changed. And what you see down the bottom in the red is the percentage of all of the attacks in Europe that are being experienced by this group, right? And you can see last year, there were 1, 2, 3, 2% of all of the attacks that are going on in broader Europe. And then suddenly in January, it goes up to 7% and then up as high as 26% of all the attacks in Europe. And then it starts to decline. And this is not just Ukraine. This is a much broader group of Eastern European countries. So, you know, this is extremely challenging because you can see this attack landscape is changing within a series of months. And within a series of months, countries that had not seen a high degree of attacks were suddenly overwhelmed. And this is an extremely challenging dynamic, not just for contractors to pull people and throw them into region, get them ready and seasoned on the networks that need to be defended or in some cases recovered, but it's extremely difficult for primes and for donors and other governments to move as fast as this attack landscape and to even predict where it's going to go, because as you can see, in July, it started to drop off again. So just dialing in really into this group, this Eastern European, this Europe and Eurasia group, you can see that in fact, Russia is being targeted a lot more than Ukraine. And you can see the rest of Europe and Eurasia is kind of the noise relative to the attacks that these two entities are experiencing. And so, of course, why the sudden surge? Well, this has really been the first case of where we have seen third parties, a call on third parties to mobilize and support one side or the other. And of course, you've got on the right-hand side, you've got Ukraine's IT army. Some people call it a cyber army with hundreds. At some point, I heard hundreds of thousands of hackers, both within and outside Ukraine, which were focusing on operational targets identified by the Ukrainian government. And of course, you know, the hacktivist group Anonymous, which we would all call a criminal organization, has also taken up the Ukrainian flag and is claimed to have hacked thousands of Russian cyber targets and government websites, etc. But there are a growing number of other hacktivists on the Russian side as well. So the pro-Russian hacktivist groups and threat actors, you can see them actually operating very openly on Telegram channels. And we've got a couple up here: Zaxnet Team, Killnet, InfoCenter, and the Cyber Army of Russia. Depending on the handle, it's _reborn. These hacktivist groups are directly coordinating their attacks with Russia's main intelligence directorate, which we call APT-28 or Fancy Bear. But these attacks are very well timed and very well coordinated with other activities from the Russian government. So this is a very unusual kind of evolution. When we look at who the advanced persistent threat actors are, though, you can see that when we look at ransomware attack attribution, Russia is 83% of that ecosystem. In terms of number of attacks, and to be honest, this correlates, well, China actually has a lot more APT actors, but Russia is extremely active with the APT actors that they do have. And as has been seen before with North Korea, these are not just DDoS attacks, these are not just disabling attacks. These attacks also have a financial motive. And as sanctions increase on Russia, we can expect to see more and more ransomware attacks coming out of Russia in order to fund the war and fund other activities. So there has been some good news, right? 5 years ago, if I showed this slide, the standard amount of days that an average attacker would be in your network would be close to 6 months. So the average number of days is now down to 24 days. Now that's mainly, I'll admit, it's because most of the attacks are ransomware attacks, and a ransomware threat actor has no interest in dwelling in your network. They want to ransom you as quickly as possible before you discover them and kick them out. But in contrast, the APTs, these advanced persistent threat actors, and these are state actors as well as hacktivists, as well as criminal cartels. These groups are in your network for 700 days or more. And so what is challenging about this from an assistance point of view is you have to start now to defend a network where you may not actually see the threat actor evolve and reveal themselves for another 2 years. And that is a very difficult scenario in which to show really hard metrics of improvement, which donors are frequently under. But this is the reality of the adversary. There is no point focusing on the short-term ransomware attackers. It's the APT attackers that are really focusing on critical infrastructure and staying there for several years. And these are the attackers that many of the governments throughout Europe and Eurasia are looking for assistance to discover. Let me quickly touch on some shifting in the kind of sectors that adversaries are going after. So looking back at Europe as a whole, the government and public sector is still the largest single sector that is being targeted. And depending on what type of attack type you're looking at, if you're looking at ransomware, that number is closer to 40%, right? But you can see in the last year that there have been some really interesting changes, right? Firstly, let's go left to right. Other, right? Other is everything except these specific focused areas, has more than doubled. And what's happening there is, instead of focusing on traditionally finance and government, and maybe healthcare, the adversary is now looking much more broadly and moving right across the critical infrastructure arena. Food and consumer goods those attacks have halved. Great news if you're in those industries, but that's probably because those efforts are being diverted kind of more broadly. Healthcare and pharmaceuticals and research. Again, that is almost half of what it was a year ago. Unsurprising, because a large part of those attacks were driven at getting healthcare data of individuals because of COVID, and also getting access to therapies because of COVID. So that you can see these dramatic waves. Utilities, energy, transportation, they're maintaining flat. And interestingly enough, and the media and entertainment attacks have really started to increase. And this is particularly interesting because this is often not a very cyber savvy stakeholder, but you have threat actors that are looking to control the message. And they're attacking both traditional media and new digital media. So what to do? You've got these huge shifts happening within a year, dramatic industry changes. You have countries experiencing extensive changes in like 6-month periods. And I wanted to just very briefly touch on an experience we've had with CRDF, where we have seen certain types of collaboration actually play out as an accelerator and be able to cope in this environment. So we first met CRDF maybe 2 years ago in 2020. We worked jointly on a program together. And, you know, we just kind of stayed friendly, kept in touch. In December of last year, they were kind enough to invite us to one of the cybersecurity cluster meetings that they run for Ukraine. This wasn't their first meeting at all. In fact, I think this was probably number 8 or number 7. And it was under the CRDF's program with Department of State EURES, which we're not part of that program. We then attended multiple of these cluster meetings and just listened in really because we were servicing Ukrainian stakeholders, we wanted to make sure we really understood what was going on. And we were just listening in these meetings and these conversations. And that's when Mr. Prokopenko from NSDC in April made a statement that Ukrainian critical infrastructure stakeholders and needed misinformation and disinformation training. And this was actually a cluster meeting that was about telecommunications needs. But we heard the statement, and he may not know this, but within 2 months, we had completely changed the topic and the attack vectors that we were going to model in a tabletop exercise that we were conducting under the USAID, USCA e-governance and technology program. So we wove in and changed the storyline so that it had a heavy education component on misinformation and disinformation. Those tabletop exercises were delivered to 10 countries, 19 energy operators. I believe 8 of them were Ukrainian, significant participation from Ukrainian energy operators, even despite the war. And, you know, it's a good example of where continued collaboration and communication and ensuring that people continually listen to the needs that the stakeholders have mean that we as an entire US government assistance community or an international community can be weaving those needs into the assistances that we've already got going. Because otherwise, if we had to start in April, it would possibly have been 6 to 8 months before that would be delivered. So constant communication and collaboration between the different stakeholders is needed. There's a lot of other things that are needed, but I think I'll stop there and hand back to Tina. I'm really happy to share our experiences as to what works. We know that open lines of communication between mission-led organizations absolutely works. And most importantly, we need all stakeholders to be hearing input from individuals like Mr. Prokopenko and Ms. Timoshenko, because that's how we can actually learn and incorporate it in our future programs. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you, Claudia. We couldn't agree, we at CRDF couldn't agree with you more about, collaboration as an accelerator. I think, we, because of what we do here, fundamentally knew that, but it has definitely come to the front of mind as we've worked together in this Ukrainian crisis, right? We sit in an interesting spot because many people know we're out there, and they're just the reach out, over the last, whatever it's been now, 9, 10, 12 months has been coming pretty fast and furious. Like this morning, we just announced, we're working as the platform for the Cyber Defense Assistance Collaborative, because we've got a number of industry partners who want to help. They don't know exactly how to help, because we're in a war effort, both governments and industry and people in the assistance space are all kind of scrambling a minute. But what has proven to be very effective is the collaboration among entities and people willing to share information and so forth. So thank you, Claudia. We definitely agree with your points. And from our perspective, there is nobody who's more engaged or on the front line of that than our team that's in Ukraine. So I'd like to now welcome Vladlen Baisti, who is our senior project lead for our cybersecurity program in Ukraine at CRDF Global. Vladlen is an English-speaking professional with experience in IT services, critical infrastructure protection, cybersecurity, customer support, service support, project management, training, and professional development. He's pretty much just an overall rock star. And yes, I know I'm biased. He is a co-author of research papers such as IFES feasibility study on the introduction of new elections technology for Ukraine, and an IFES white paper titled Considerations on Internet Voting, an overview for electoral decision makers. Also a concept of development of a system of training specialists in critical infrastructure protection for Ukraine. He's done research on Ukraine for the International Critical Infrastructure Protection book and research on critical infrastructure protection education in Ukraine that Irina mentioned earlier. We here at CRDF are very honored to have Vladlen as part of our team. Please join me in welcoming him to the meeting. And Vladlen, now over to you.
Thank you, Tina, for the introduction. I appreciate it a lot. Dear colleagues, partners, representatives of the local and international private business, dear participants from all over the world who joined our webinar. In my presentation, I would like to touch topics connected with general situation of the infrastructure of Ukraine since the beginning of the Russian brutal and unprovoked war against our country. Also, I will speak about the current state of play of public-private partnership for the protection of the national CI of Ukraine from cyber physical attacks, as well as the prospects for the restoration of the damaged critical infrastructure assets and facilities within the wartime. Furthermore, I would like to discuss the potential of the professional roles and capacities of those professionals who will be responsible for critical infrastructure security and resilience. And finally, I will provide an update on what kind of assistance has already been provided by CRDF Global Ukraine team in 2021 and our current and future plans. Next slide, please. Thank you, Irina. By waging of the full-scale attack against Ukraine, Russia left us with very limited choice. Either we give up or we stand, resist, and fight. We chose to fight for our freedom, our values, for our nation, people, children, future of our generation, and also for our critical infrastructure. As it was mentioned today, our Ukrainian critical infrastructure is being attacked both physically and in the cyber domain, and has been under the massive disinformation attacks, including on the critical infrastructure issues. Currently, Russia is losing on the battlefield, and now they are doing these acts of terror against the civilians and critical energy infrastructure facilities. The recent escalation since October 10th has substantially eroded the power grid's resilience and operational integrity. Russian missiles and battle drone attacks on the energy critical infrastructure cause the cascade effect on the lack of electricity supply for other critical infrastructure sectors in a number of the regions of Ukraine, and especially it feels very sensitive for Kyiv city and Kyiv region. Under these conditions, Ukraine has taken steps to reduce electricity consumption, including planned blackouts in Kyiv and other major cities across the country. Just like for your understanding, that current electricity blackouts period we are dealing right now, it's about from 10 till 12 hours per day. And at the same time, European Union nations expect that latest attacks to prompt new wave of the refugees. And current refugees have been urged by government of Ukraine to remain abroad over the winter time. Also, disrupted power supply also threatens military operations, particularly if communication lines are impaired. Definitely, we all understand here that all damaged energy and other critical systems supposed to be not only reconstructed, but also to be very well protected from the cyber and physical future attacks. And taking into the account that military threat from Russia, because I mean, even after our victory, Russia would still be our neighbor. And that means that all of the threats would be for all of our life and the life of our kids. So we need time to do this. And in our today's situation, our first task is to maintain the system and to survive in the current conditions. Next slide, please. Thank you. You just heard from Irina Timoshenko about the scale of the critical energy infrastructure damage in Ukraine. And I would like to present some points from the Russia Will Pay project of Kyiv School of Economics. And the main goal of this project is to collect, evaluate, analyze, and document all information on direct losses to civilian infrastructure in connection with Russian aggression. So if you look on the slide, according to the project data, the amount of damage caused to the infrastructure of Ukraine since February 24th has reached more than 127 billions of US dollars. This is statistic as of the end of September 22. The largest share in the total amount of losses belongs to residential buildings. It's more than 50 billion USD. And in the second place, in the term of the amount of losses, is the spheres of infrastructure, which is more than $35 billion. Cumulative direct losses from destruction and damage to public sector objects such as social objects, institutions, educational, scientific, and healthcare institutions, cultural buildings, sports facilities, administration buildings, etc. Amounts is more than $11.6 billion. The losses of business assets are minimum around like 10 billion and growing rapidly. Please, next slide. Thank you. Since the beginning of the existential war of Ukrainian nation against Russian aggression, millions of Ukrainian citizens private companies, international community started united in the volunteering groups or organizations to assist and support armed forces of Ukraine, local territorial defense units, temporary displaced people, organize evacuation of population and animals from the war battle zones, protection of the cyberspace and critical infrastructure facilities, providing medical assistance, delivering food and water supplies to populations of the deoccupied cities from Russian troops, restoration of the destroyed or damaged infrastructure in the regions of Ukraine. On our own experience, we understand that effective public-private partnership plays a key role on the successful security and resilience of our critical infrastructure. And I would like to present some couple of examples of such successful stories. For example, like Ukrainian companies, Ajax and Stavcom, at the beginning of the war, they created air raid alarm application. And this initiative was supported by the Ministry of Digital Transformation of Ukraine. The air raid alerts became an urgent issue with the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And in many cities, villages, the sirens, they were not heard. And every minute to check the chats of the regional administration via Viber or Telegram applications was very challenging procedure for residents. Recently, another one Ukrainian company named Technari, after massive missile and drone attacks, they created anti-missile and anti-aircraft defense applications. And with the help of this application, you can report the movement of any Russian air targets. So Ukrainian citizens can notify our army forces on any enemy missiles, drones, airplanes, or helicopter through these electronic applications. I would like to give an example from the cybersecurity from one of the US manufacturers of passwordless authentication devices, Hydis and Ubiquus. They donated more than 20,000 YubiKeys. The YubiKeys, they enable smart card authentication, and it allows three different protocols to be used simultaneously. So such donations provided assistance to Ukrainian workers at one of the state-owned company in the critical infrastructure sector, assisted to increase the access and cybersecurity protection of the internal information critical system. And final one, but not the last one, of many public-private partnership examples, like on October 6th, the US Agency of International Development, USAID, they announced 55 million on emergency assistance aimed at the repairing heating infrastructure and delivering power generators and alternative fuel sources. So there are so many cases right now from different countries like Estonia, Germany, Sweden, United States of America, and so on. Please move to next slide. Thank you. As it was mentioned today, the State Special Communication Service of Ukraine has been approved as a temporary CIP agency for the time of war and 12 months period after the end of war. And according to the approved law, they will need to recruit and train CIP professionals to manage the operations of CI system in Ukraine. Also, Ms. Tymoshenko, at her presentation, she stressed on the lack of high qualified trained critical infrastructure specialists in Ukraine, who are so needed for this new established CIP agency, as well as for critical infrastructure protection sectors, ministries, and agencies. Currently in Ukraine, there have been made a lot of internal and public discussions and roundtables regarding the roles and needed professional capacities of those professionals who will be responsible for critical infrastructure security and resilience. So, what kind of competencies, capacity, technical and non-technical skills should have these critical infrastructure professionals? If we consider best CIP world practices, people interested in this career path need fundamental skills and competencies to effectively enforce critical infrastructure protection. Professionals in this field must have very good knowledge and understanding in the national approved legislation, concepts, conducted researches, laws, procedures, and methodologies, sector-specific plans and guidelines and strategies. So on the slide, you can see two different columns, I would like to say. The green one, it's already developed procedures, laws, methodologies, researches in Ukraine. And red one, this mentioned are pending documents, plans, guidelines that Ukraine will need to develop in the nearest time. Can we move on, please, to the next slide? Continuing the previous slide discussion, I would like to mention that CIP professionals need to have also very strong knowledge and understanding and capacity, experience in identifying and determine the criticality of national infrastructure, determine critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, establishing public-private partnership between government and private sector owners and operators of critical infrastructure, developing and exercising continuity of operation and information technology disaster recovery plans, providing physical and cybersecurity and resilience measures, fostering local, regional, national, international cooperation to achieve specific goals, objectives, and also many other skills and knowledges are needed to be developed. Next slide. Thank you. CIP professionals can work and provide their services at different agencies, government organizations, fusion centers, regional CIP departments, at law enforcement, defense, intel agencies, as well as in the critical infrastructure specific sector facility or in CIP experts community. So for example, if we consider infrastructure protection unit at the regional level, the CIP this unit will need to provide infrastructure protection services to help ensure security and resilience across the whole territory of the region. And the unit will need to take the collaborative approach by working with regional, local, private sector partners to enhance the overall security and regional most critical assets. If we consider CIP experts community, also known as a protective security advisory groups, these are very well-trained critical infrastructure protection and vulnerability mitigation subject matter experts who facilitate local field activities in coordination with national, homeland, law enforcement, security, intel, and emergency offices. And they also provide advice and assist in planning, conducting outreach activities, and providing access to critical infrastructure, security, and resilience resources, on training information for critical infrastructure owners, operators, community groups, and faith-based organizations. I would like to note that, like, for example, for Poland, our neighbors, it took around 10 years to train and develop CIP professional systems for their national critical infrastructure protection system. The training of those specialists was the first step of Poland that started in the development of their national critical infrastructure protection system. I believe that with international support, Ukraine could go more faster, at least for 5 or 7 next years. Please, next slide. Thank you. I would like to mention that 2021 was very productive for CRDF Global involvement and in providing assistance for launching of CIP system development in Ukraine. We organized and provided together with our partner Service of Critical Infrastructure Security of National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, practical workshops for governmental officials in the regions, critical infrastructure operators, law enforcement, defense, security, and intel agency representatives. Both workshops were conducted together with support of our US partners such as Sovereign Ventures, NextPeak, and NOSIP National Security Group. We also conducted national discussion on CIP system development of Ukraine at one of the sessions of our National Cybersecurity Cluster and we took active participation in partners' conferences to bring the input of foreign assistance for local counterparts. Next slide, please. We also assisted with initiation of the introductory coordination and planning meeting between CIP and SDC office and US CISA DHS agency. Today's webinar is a continuation of CRDF Globe launched CIP initiative in December 2021, which allows virtually to organize and have discussions with the state organization, scientific community, Ukraine's and international private sector, partner governments on the challenges of critical infrastructure security and resilience, and on enhancing critical infrastructure protection in general, based on Ukraine's and international experience. We also assisted to our partners from the National Security Defense Council, National Cybersecurity Coordination Center, with the development of the Cybersecurity Strategy 21-24, with development law on the critical infrastructure protection, and with drafting of the concept of CIP professional system development in Ukraine. Next slide, please. We also continued our efforts on CIP system development for Ukraine in 2022. As Tina already mentioned, we conducted research and published analytical paper on the critical infrastructure protection education system in Ukraine. Jointly with the head of NSDC CIP service on critical infrastructure security, Ms. Irina Timoshenko, we conducted a lot of working meetings, consultations with international donors and a variety of embassies on arranging international program assistance and planning additional funds for CIP system development in Ukraine. CRDF Global Kyiv team developed and presented to donors the CIP Global Program proposal for CIP system development in Ukraine, which contains around 20 program areas. And we just started preparation for the implementation of the first phase of CIP program assistance for Ukraine with the support of US Department of State, and it will be implemented jointly with NSDC CIP office with involving Ukrainian CIP national and international experts from critical infrastructure sector, agencies, private business, and research institutions. That's actually all I plan to present today at the meeting, and I will be very happy to respond on the questions at the Q&A session. So I'm passing the floor back to Tina.
Thank you, Vladlen. And thank you to all of our panelists for a very informative and engaging conversation this morning. I think Vladlen and I are going to have to tag team the Q&A a little bit. Vladlen, I can handle the English ones if you can help me with the Ukrainian ones. And what I'm going to try to do is we have a number of questions and there's themes to them. So what I'll try to do is try to organize some thematic questions that hopefully get at what individuals have asked. And Serhiy, the first couple themed are really around things I think you might be able to best start the conversation around. So during your presentation, you were speaking about, you know, the cybersecurity attacks and the timing of that, what you saw. There's really two themes of questions being asked. First, you know, in your opinion, what environment, what parts of the Ukrainian environment were better protected during the attacks than others? And are there, you know, weaknesses or areas we should think about as industry helping you with? And secondly, as you went through that phase, did you find the Russian offensive cyber operations greater than you expected or more complex than you expected at this point? So I will stop there and start with Serhiy, and then obviously any of the other panelists feel free to comment once he's answered.
Дякую за цікаві питання.
Thank you for your interesting questions. Well, answering the question about which region or who was better protected, as I said in my presentation, Ukraine managed to raise its cybersecurity protection level in every sector, but probably the most protected sector was the banking and financial field, because the National Bank traditionally has been focusing a lot of efforts on cybersecurity, and this attention included allocation of appropriate resources, and probably indeed banking was one of the most resilient sectors. The rest we're also trying to be on the level of the financial sector, and I hope that we will be able to ensure the proper protection in every field possible. As to your second question about capabilities of Russia and whether they have been sufficient or not, or exhausted their capacities or not, well, I have talked to many experts on that, and my personal opinion now is that what they had been preparing for the beginning of February, all these resources, I believe that they have exhausted that, but we see some indications that make us believe that new cyber operations are being prepared, and they will be more complicated, and those cyber attacks, cyber operations, they may be rather on a strategic level, focused on theft of information, stealing of information, and damage of infrastructure in several countries that are providing support to Ukraine in Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression. So for the future, I think they are trying to accumulate forces, and it probably we can expect new steps on behalf of Russia in that regard.
Mhm. Yeah, no, very, very well said. Thank you. Thank you. The next question that we have is really probably a combination, Sergey, for you and for you, Irina, and it has to do with kinetic threats versus cyber threats. We talked about both today in the various presentations, and the question really is, can you speak to the prioritization of cyber versus kinetic defenses? And in your opinion, which kinetic threats must require the most immediate mitigation? Irina, maybe I'll start with you, since in your presentation, we spoke much about the infrastructure and the damage that's been done. So as you think about those attacks, are there certain areas that require more immediate attention than others in your perspective?
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for your question.
Перше, зрозуміло, враховуючи те, що ми зараз
Well,
стоїмо напередодні
certainly, since we are now on the eve of the heating season, autumn and winter, certainly the most vulnerable area that we prioritize today is the power sector and public utilities sector, to provide appropriate services to our citizens. For example, in Luhansk region, during the occupation, as they are occupied now, there is no chance to provide public utility services there, because all the facilities there have been fully destroyed, and unfortunately people do not have heating today, or water supply, or other services, never mind the mobile communication. Also, if we talk about Mykolaiv region, at the beginning of the full-scale aggression, the water pipeline was destroyed there, and that pipeline provided most of the Mykolaiv region and the city of Mykolaiv with potable water. And this water pipeline until recently was occupied in the area that was occupied, and during this time all the people didn't have water supply with potable water. They could only get water for other purposes or non-potable. The 11th of November, our military deoccupied Kherson, and all our public utility services have established what was damaged in this water pipeline. There were 4 major accidents on it, and now they are working to repair them and to ensure water supply. So what I mean is we focus today on the facilities that ensure proper living conditions for people, as well as power facilities, because the damages of this sector result in cascade damage, because we lose opportunity to supply our citizens with water too and heating. So this is our major priorities today. Obviously, repairing roads is also among our priorities. Residential houses have been damaged. Many people lost their houses. All the problems are important, certainly, but the public utility sector and the power sector are on top of our list.
Thank you. Thank you, Irina. Sergey, is there anything you would like to add to that conversation before we move to the next
Ну, я
question?
думаю, що ми прямим свідченням того, що
I think that an indirect confirmation is that our power sector is quite powerful is the fact that they are trying to indeed damage the sector kinetically, where they couldn't really damage it in terms of the cyber attacks. So they are trying to just to destroy it physically.
You know, I think that's a very, very astute observation, you know, and a credit to you and your team and others partnered with you on creating that resiliency inside the cyber defenses. So that's one small bright spot here, I suppose. Vladlen, if you could help me with the next 2 questions, they're in Ukrainian. So if you don't mind taking the stage, that'd be great.
Дякую, Тіно. Звичайно,
Thank you, Tina. Certainly, the question, it's not a question, it's a kind of request from Irina Leonidovna, Director of Civilian and Industrial Security in the National Aviation University, and Batir Hamuradov. Dear Miss Irina, please help students of National Aviation University to get internship in terms of the educational program on protection of critical infrastructure facilities. Well, thank you. I am in constant touch with the operators of critical infrastructure in the power sector, and on Friday, we had this conversation, and the Ukrenergo said that they also need that kind of support. They're interested in strong experts. I think we can discuss this internship issue. We may even meet for a conversation, and yeah, we can work on it. And certainly, yeah, let's meet and talk. Thank you.
Ірина Леонідівна, за пропозицію. Наступне питання.
Thank you for the proposal. Next question is from Andrei Skibnev. When will the register of critical infrastructure objects be created, and which agency will be responsible for keeping it, filling it with information and support?
Відповідно до закону України про критичну
According to the law on critical
інфраструктуру,
infrastructure,
перелік
the sectoral lists are created by a sectoral agency, so appropriate ministry or department responsible for a particular sector of critical infrastructure. Now I can say that the Ministry of Energy has approved their list of critical infrastructure objects. Other sectoral bodies are working on their lists. As to the national register of critical infrastructure, and according to the law, and in fact, and the authorized agency for protection of critical infrastructure will be responsible. So starting from the 5th of December, we'll have this authorized body under the Service on Protection of Information. And I think they will make these efforts effective, because the fact that we didn't have that kind of agency prevented us from coordination of the efforts of all the ministries and departments. As to the objects that are being protected today by armed forces of Ukraine, the general staff, along with other agencies, have prepared a list of critical important objects that must be protected by the armed forces of Ukraine. So this is the situation we have today. Thank you for your answer. Next question from Andrei. For a quick repair of critical infrastructure at the beginning of 2000, there was a special fund of documentation that was established. It was called the kind of insurance fund of documents. So when can it be deployed fully to ensure that the damaged infrastructure objects can be repaired as soon as possible? The law on critical infrastructure has an article about the insurance, and it becomes effective 3 years after the law becomes effective, and that is done to make sure that our insurance companies can develop their programs and introduce them in Ukraine.
Дякую, Ірина Леонідівна, за відповідь.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Now, these are all the questions that I have in English, and let's have a look at some of the questions we've had in English. So that was all the questions in Ukrainian. Now we'll take a look at some of the questions in English. Sorry.
No worries. Yeah, the next question I have, well done, Vladlen. The next question I have is from Roland Bierce, and it's again for Irina. It says, Irina, I know that there are many people who would be willing to teach the required skills to perform CIP work streams. Is there funding available to do such training out of country or virtually? Meaning, can would the training be helpful if it was done via a virtual platform or better in country?
Well, I would say that currently it's better to do that virtually, considering the situation and in the war in Ukraine. So that will have a better impact in terms of the security for the trainees and for the trainers as well. But during the time of peace, we have an experience of conducting both online trainings as well as some of the offline trainings as well. And just wanted to say that we have an experience, a fairly good one, of having theoretical and even practical exercises and trainings online, meaning that some of our trainees, they had a chance to work in groups, and it was very interesting. So now I'd say that there is a possibility of doing all of this online, and there's an absolutely wonderful attitude to that, and we have the capabilities to do that. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Irina. I'm going to move down through. I think we've handled some of these.
I mean, some just like a comments, appreciation of our works. Some experts, I mean, in Ukrainian, they say that they could share with us additional materials as needed, and also assist with trainings, and other assistance, based on the current requests.
Perfect. Let's see. I guess the one topic we haven't addressed through these questions, Vladlen, if you agree, is Ronald Beers asks again, or asks a question in the vein of Russian cyber defense. So Sergey and maybe Claudia would be interesting to hear your thoughts. And the question is, how does Ukraine assess Russian cyber defenses at this time? Are cyber operations directed against Russians achieving success?
I would just say, Tina, if I might, Mr. Prokopenko made an excellent point, which was some of the attacks on the Russian, different Russian assets were sometimes the only means of at the time getting the truth out to the Russian citizens. So it really depends on how you define success. But from a bystander's point of view, it certainly does look like the pro-Ukrainian attackers have had some successes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Sergey, anything you'd like to add to that conversation?
Буквально недавно було опубліковано результати дослідження, за яким Росія вийшла на перше місце серед країн.
Well, talking about these had the countries with most of the losses of personal data and leakages of personal data, and that gives some indirect assessment of what was happening in Russia. So the cyber defense of Russia has turned into a myth, actually, and the same goes for the sake of their ability to protect resources. On the other hand, we can see also, and as I've already mentioned, the most difficult times were just before the large-scale aggression, a couple of days after that. And also we had very interesting times when the community of volunteers started to repel those attacks and started to take some active measures as well, including by compromising the Russian systems. And it appeared that their resources are also not unlimited, and they've started to divert some of their assets to protect their own resources from attacking our Ukrainian ones. That is why I think this question requires a special or separate analysis. It could be a separate topic for a discussion, but on the overall, I'd say there's very positive results from such actions, and it's available in Cyber Dimension.
Great, thank you, Sergey. I am sensitive to the fact that it is getting late in the evening for our Ukrainian participants, so maybe Vladlen, unless there's something in Ukraine significant you think I've missed, I'm going to finish with one final question before we go. And that question is from Kostjanya. And the question is, what are in the panelists' opinion, what are the most priority actions to increase CIP resilience in Ukraine during the wartime? And I think I'll open that one up to anyone who'd like to comment because it's pretty broad. It's a good one.
I mean, Tina, you simply have to keep the energy on,
Mhm.
the energy grid. I mean, the entire country and all the services depend on it. And so anything that keeps the power on, I think, must be the priority.
Mhm.
And as I mentioned in my presentation, and Claudia just like mentioned that energy, that we should think not only about the restoration, but the physical and cybersecurity of it in the future, in the current time. And as I mentioned in my presentation about our neighbors, but not only Russia, but Belarus, who knows what will happen with Moldova and so on. So we will need to think strategically, and as I explained about the professional capacities of the critical infrastructure professionals, this will be like a future profession to defend and to make critical infrastructure resilient and stable. So it will unite both cyber, physical, disinformation, counterintelligence, and all in one. We just like slowly, step by step moving, but this is our future, and this is what we consider actually like for Ukraine. If you have an energy facility in the region and USAP professional, you need actually to develop cybersecurity, physical security of it. You need to talk, to law enforcement and military guys, and probably to create maybe a small dome that will protect your facility. And this project could raise to big, more potential program for Ukraine, just like to have dome programs that will protect us from all cyber and especially physical threats that we are dealing, with our neighbors currently and maybe in the future.
Great.
From
Go ahead,
the
Vlad.
point of Ukrainian, the people are asking about the presentations, if we can share. What we usually do, we just ask our speakers the permission, to share the presentation. And as soon as we receive these permissions, we usually share with everyone who registered and who participated, in the webinar. Also, there is another request, and I think it's to Irina Timoshenko from State University Zhytomyrská Polytechnica, and I think it's also a request to Sergei Prokopenko. They're asking about giving the contacts of the responsible person, at your offices for establishing cooperation between university and also with the CRDF, our state offices, CAP, and National Cybersecurity Coordination Center, and with the CRDF global program. That's basically it, if we speak about the Ukrainian questions in the chat.
Great. Thank you, Vladlen. It's very helpful. Well, I'd like to thank everybody who joined us today as a participant. I definitely want to give my heartfelt gratitude to our panelists. I think the last comment in the Q&A string actually says it best, and that is from Subash, and he says, "Congratulations to all members of the cybersecurity team of Ukraine. I think the experience of Ukraine will be useful to other countries to develop their workforce." And I think that's a lesson for all of us to learn. All that has happened in Ukraine has been shown us how a capable, dedicated team of international partners can do really good work together when we share information and work together. And that's really the purpose of our webinars and our thought leadership events that we hold. Is our goal is to share information with key constituents and people who are interested, so we can do good things together throughout the world, and today specifically in Ukraine. So Irina, Sergei, Claudia, and Vladlen, of course, thank you very much for your comments today. And we look forward to seeing all of you on another CRDF Global Thought Leadership webinar in the near future. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening, good afternoon, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Дякую, до побачення, на все добре.
Thank you. We'll see you. Bye-bye.